This is the third in my series of videos about criticisms of benefit cost analysis. And this time I'm going to look at the criticism that says basically that discounting is bad. Now, discounting is used in benefit cost analysis in order to help us compare benefits and costs that occur at different times, which they typically do. And so, economists consider it to be a fairly essential part of their methodology within benefit cost analysis. But sometimes people are critical of discounting because they feel it leads to objectionable results. Really, results they don't like and they think are wrong, and it's all because of discounting. So let's explore this a little bit further. Let's start by asking, why do economists want to discount in the first place? And as I've said, it's because we need to compare benefits and costs that occur at different times. Typically, although not always, the pattern is that the costs are relatively large early on and the benefits are relatively large later. And so we're often trying to allow for the fact that we're looking at current costs and comparing them to future benefits. And when we make that comparison in a benefit cost analysis, it's important to understand that we're doing more than taking out inflation. Inflation is part of what we need to adjust for because there's inflation in future numbers, but it's more than just that. It's also the fact that there is an opportunity cost that needs to be accounted for. This opportunity cost says or arises because if we spend money on a particular project, let's say project X, then we have to give up something else. I'll call that project Y. Project Y could be anything, but maybe it could be a project that could be, we could call it have less debt, right? We're having to borrow money to pay for project X. So project Y is have less debt by not borrowing that money. So in that case, the opportunity cost is the interest rate on the borrowings that we've made in order to pay for project X. Another potential reason, or another sort of source of an opportunity cost, is the fact that people prefer good things sooner. They're somewhat impatient. And that's reflected in the fact that people often borrow money to bring forward consumption. They'll borrow money to buy some consumption goods that they would otherwise have to wait until they'd saved up enough money. So that reflects that they have this impatience or this preference for having good things sooner rather than later. Okay, so the funding that we use to allow project X to proceed may be from a source that displaces spending on consumption. And in that case, the opportunity cost is the delayed consumption, and that too is reflected in the interest rates that people have to pay for borrowings because people are competing in the market for credit, and so how much they're willing to pay for that credit reflects how much they care about bringing consumption earlier in time. Okay, so we've got these opportunity costs that are part of the cost of doing project X. So from that description, you can see that discounting has a close relationship with the payment of interest, whether we're paying it out or receiving it. So it's a bit like having to pay interest on the upfront costs and that interest cost compounding over time. So that's really very, very close to what we're doing when we apply discounting. Discounting implicitly adds an interest cost onto the project costs. That is really what it's doing, okay? That's the essential idea behind discounting. The fact that when you spend money, there is either explicitly or implicitly something that's very similar to an interest cost, and that interest cost will increase the overall cost of doing the project. And we need to account for that. Now, if you're familiar with the mathematical procedure of discounting, you may feel, and I think with some justification, that that insight that I've just said is a little bit obscured, because the way that discounting works in practice is that it scales down the benefits rather than scaling up the costs. I've just described it as a process of scaling up the costs, but the actual discounting procedure acts by scaling down the benefits. It does that because it's somewhat convenient. It allows benefits and costs to be expressed in present day terms. And that's okay, because whichever way you do this, scaling down the benefits or scaling up the costs, are equivalent in the terms of what they'll do to what our conclusions about whether a particular project is good or bad or indifferent. So you get the same result, but if you use the normal approach of scaling down the benefits, it does somewhat obscure the logic of why are we doing this. So much so that I think sometimes even economists forget that what we're really doing is allowing for the fact that there is this opportunity cost and this can compound over time. Now, I just said the word compounding, and compounding is really important. Compounding is the reason that discounting matters so much and has such a big influence, because compounding has a big effect in the long term. So when I say compounding, I mean that you borrow money, you pay some interest on that, and then in the next period you have to pay interest not just on the amount you borrowed, but also on the interest from the previous period. And then in the period after that, you pay interest on the interest on the interest, and so on. And so this grows and grows over time in a pattern like in this graph. And in many ways, this is a very familiar thing, because most of us sort of know about this happening when you take out a home loan. We all know, or most of us are aware, that when you pay off a home loan, you end up, if you just added up the number of dollars paid, it will be a lot more than the amount of money that you originally borrowed, because of all the interest that you've had to pay and because that interest has compounded over time. So that's why a discount rate or a discount factor has a big effect on benefit cost analysis, because the same thing is happening. The interest on the upfront cost is compounding in a very similar way as in a home loan. So putting all that together, what that means is that there are actually 3 components in a benefit cost analysis, not 2. We think of the 2 obvious ones, the benefits from the project and the costs from the project, the direct costs and so on. But actually there's a 3rd item, which is the compounded opportunity cost of capital that we use to pay for the project. And in the long run, the problem is, if it's a problem, that last item can tend to dominate the calculations. It can actually be the biggest single factor, and it can mean that a project that superficially looks like a good one is actually not a good one because of this opportunity cost of capital overwhelming the calculations. And it's this that can lead to unpopular results. It can lead to projects that superficially look like good ones seeming bad or being revealed as being bad when you put them through a benefit cost analysis. For example, an unpopular result could be something like when there are benefits in the distant future, and these count for very little within the benefit cost analysis. So for example, if there was a benefit of $1 million that occurred in 100 years' time, and we used a discount rate of 7%, then that $1 million would be reduced to 1,152 in present value terms, and it's only that $1,000 odd that would be counted in our benefit cost analysis. So that's very striking. That's quite a big discount rate, but it's until quite recently that was the sort of discount rate that we were using routinely in benefit cost analysis. So a result like this, where what seems like a big benefit gets reduced to nothing much, could be seen as unreasonable or unfair on future generations, or just unwise or just wrong. Surely that can't be right, because it seems to be reducing the benefits by a large amount, in fact by a factor of 868. But as I've tried to explain, that's a bit misleading. What's really going on here is that we're trying to account for the fact that the costs are 868 times bigger than they originally looked, because of this compounding effect and this compounded interest component that has built up over the 100 years and has to be factored in as well. All right, so that's really the essential point and the essential argument why we need to do discounting. So what if we didn't do discounting? People, it's not uncommon to see people saying we shouldn't be discounting at all, or we should be using a discount rate of 0, which amounts to the same thing. Well, that's a problem. That would mean we were ignoring a cost. And perhaps that's the biggest single cost. So, if you wouldn't really see, I've never seen anyone argue that we should be ignoring the upfront cost of a project because they don't like the results. You can't just sort of ignore them. They're there, they're real costs. But actually, trying to ignore discounting is every bit as indefensible as ignoring the upfront costs. They're just costs. So how could you possibly just justify ignoring them? Now, there's one thing in the present time, I make this video in 2021, which is quite striking, which is that we are currently living with record low or extremely low interest rates. And so that has a big influence on what effect discounting has when we apply those low discount rates in a benefit cost analysis. So if we think that those low discount rates will last for the duration of our BCA, the duration that we're considering, then a much lower discount rate as a result of these low interest rates will really make a big difference to the results. I guess I'd observe that these very low interest rates may or may not last. I don't know. I've heard arguments on both sides. But either way, we need to keep discounting and doing it with whatever is a realistic discount rate for that time, and for our expectations about what will happen to discount rates over the time frame that we're looking. So there's no reason why the discount rate should stay the same over the time frame, although that's often what economists do. In a situation like the present, where we've really got exceptionally low rates, you might realistically consider that they could increase in future, and you could build that into the analysis if you thought that that was realistic. And personally, I do think that is not an unreasonable thing to look at doing. So let me finish off by acknowledging that I've sort of been arguing that we should be using discounting, and the criticisms, at least the simple criticisms that people make that it's unreasonable and unfair, probably don't stack up. But I would acknowledge that there are some important conceptual and ethical issues when we use discounting over the very long time, maybe over 100 years or more. And some of those sort of challenges arise from the extreme level of uncertainty about what will happen over such long time frames. So in that situation, I think there are more reasonable questions and doubts about how to appropriately apply discounting, and in fact, in general, how to do an evaluation of a project into the distant future. In general, not just about discounting, but the whole process. However, I would observe that in practice, most benefit cost analyses use a time frame of something like 30 years, maybe 20, maybe 40, rarely more than 50. And on those shorter time frames, I think the conceptual and ethical challenges are much less, and in general, I think they're pretty minor. And so we should just be discounting, at least for time frames up to and including those sorts of numbers. Okay, in conclusion, I've started with a quote around discounting is bad. My conclusion is discounting is not bad. In fact, far from being bad, it's essential because it captures a cost. It's a real cost, and it can be an important and large cost depending on the particular situation, the discount rate and the time frame. And we can't just ignore costs because they result in us rejecting or giving advice that is negative to a project that we happen to like. We wouldn't do that for any other sort of cost. Why should we do it for this sort of cost? We shouldn't. Okay. So if you're interested in benefit cost analysis, why don't you have a look at my course called Applied Benefit Cost Analysis, which is a micro-credential course offered through the University of Western Australia. This is an online course with a mixture of recorded and live components over 12 weeks. You can do it as a standalone professional development type course, or you can include it as part of a master's degree. You can come into the course even if you have no existing economics background, and it's a really great course. The feedback I've had from my students that have already done the course has been exceptionally positive, as reflected in this quote. So if you're interested, have a look at this website, appliedbca.org, and I hope to see you in the course.